Now, once you start to believe that any individual is less than you are, then you can justify a whole lot of things. Once you start to believe that people are less than fully human, that way lies madness. That is a slippery slope that leads to the horrors of Auschwitz. It leads to the horrors of when I was a child. I remember those who had mental handicap or were severely physically disabled were poured into vast institutions where they were kept like animals in cages, and they were tended and changed occasionally. It was the same here as it was in England. And it was because we had persuaded ourselves that our brethren who were mentally challenged in some way were less than fully human, and therefore we could justify treating them like battery heads. We could justify treating them like livestock. And we do the same with prisoners. And it's because there is one phrase that is at the core of the Christian life that is lacking in the public discussion on this here in Louisiana. And it's there but for the grace of God go I. There but for the grace of God go I. Which is a natural outworking of Jesus' teaching, the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It comes of judging ourselves by our intentions and judging everybody else by their actions. And damn them if we don't like their actions. Because we have the big stick and we have Angola. And if we don't like them, well, you know, there's 5,600 beds in that prison. And if the worst comes to the worst, we can just go and build another one. And they have 120 of them in different ways, shapes and forms all over the state. When policing is combined, something like 15% of the entire state budget goes on criminality in one way, shape or form. It is a monster that just keeps pulling in more and more and more and more resources because you can frighten people into coughing up. It's self-fulfilling prophecy. So, a few facts and figures. Half of all the inmates of Louisiana's jails have a diagnosable mental illness, whether it be schizophrenia, whether it be bipolar disorder, but a diagnosable mental illness. The largest mental health facility in Greater New Orleans is the Orleans Parish Prison. That's just a fact. And yet, despite this, Louisiana spends less on medical care than any other state for its prisons. It spends exactly, let me get the figures here, $860 per person per year on health care. Maine spends $5,601 per person per year on health care. The average, even in the South, is $2,025 per person per year on health care. And that would include everything: psychological counselling, psychiatric care, drugs for people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. All that covered by that $800. So is it wonder that the vast majority of those who are mentally ill, who are now thrown into our jails, because, you know, we don't want to think that they're mentally ill, otherwise we won't be able to get revenge on them, will we, church? We can't be punitive to people if they're sick. They need treatment. But we want revenge. So what do? We throw them in jail, and we get psychiatrists to treat them so that they are sane enough to stand trial. We will pay for their medical care so that they can be made sane enough to stand trial. And yet we close our ears to the idea that maybe they weren't in their right mind when the offence was committed. Now this is me, Clinton Crawshaw, Christian, thinking about what we are doing, and I mean we because we're all in one way, shape or form complicit in it. If your mouth is quiet, if you shut up, you're complicit in it. You know? All those Germans in the Second World War were complicit in the Holocaust because they shut their mouths. That's all it takes. That's all it takes for good people to do nothing. That's all it takes for evil to happen. Well, there is an evil happening here, you know? There is an evil happening here. $653 million are spent on corrections, not including city prisons or parish facilities, every year. You know, this represents the biggest single investment in many of the communities in New Orleans. In a small part of Center City, 22 people are currently in jail, which represents, over the period of their jail term, millions of dollars. Now, if you invested millions of dollars in a very small district in Center City, what do you think the effect might be upon the youth growing up there? What do you think the effect might be for programs for people coming out of jail? What do you think the effect might be for halfway houses to lead people gently back into society? Or to bring up a generation of kids who has some aspiration, who is shown that somebody cares a damn outside of their community. I picked Center City because that's what I have the statistic on. But it represents virtually the only investment being made in their neighborhood is that their adults are being looked after in jail. And I say looked after in the broadest possible terms because the conditions in Angola are not exactly a hotel. The conditions of the parish jail are absolutely appalling at the moment. Now, this sermon is not just a rant about current conditions. What it is, at its core, is a plea to examine where we are now through the light of Scripture. And let's look again, lest we forget. The line that I decided to call this service, this particular sermon, was, "Away from me, thou accursed." Away from me, thou accursed. Now, these are not light words. The parable of the sheep and the goats, the parable, which this is a similar representation of, the parable of those who are sent into the darkness and those who are gathered into God's arms. And there's some difficult language used around that. At its core, tests each and every one of us in our ordinary lives. Because we like to convince ourselves that we're good people. And on many levels, we are good people. And good people do allow terrible things to happen. Sometimes good people even perpetrate terrible deeds. And this is where some of our misunderstanding comes from. In my first year at theological college, I was sent, well, I volunteered, but I was sent to Bullingdon Prison, which is just outside Oxford. And it's a brand new jail. It was all shiny and new and lovely, you know? But they're still awful places, no matter how shiny and new they were. So I was sent there to work with the chaplain and do some counselling among the prisoners. And I spoke to the prisoners, and the one thing that it became obvious to me that I didn't need to do was to harp on about what they'd done. It was, as Scripture tells us, ever before them. Their time in jail was spent almost exclusively dwelling upon what they'd done and trying to move past it. There's not all of them, of course. Some people are in denial, but you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. The prospects for reform were enormous. But these prisoners spent 23 hours a day in their cells. There was no opportunity for reform. There was no opportunity for any alternative than what they were used to. And they spent their time with other criminals. The only people they had to speak to were people who were in the same position as themselves. There was no way of drawing up their eyes above where they were to where they could be. And this is criminal in itself. Jesus names the least of these my children, not assuming them to be blameless or to have good excuses, but assuming them to be exactly that, the least, the weakest, whether physically, morally, or financially. He does not say, unless they have stolen some of your beloved possessions, or unless they have been violent, or unless they have sought to escape their wretchedness in illegal drugs. He doesn't even say, unless they have committed a terrible sexual crime against you, or unless they have abused those who are young and vulnerable. There are no get-outs from this. Now, this doesn't mean that we do not need to protect the vulnerable in society. Yes, we do. But there is a long way from the punitive to prevention. There is a long way from throwing people away ad infinitum for the rest of their natural lives to actually trying to